The first time Weston Calloway touched me, it was to stop me from falling off a horse. The second time, it was to wipe blood from my split lip after I mouthed off to a man twice my size. The third time, he didn't touch me at all, he just looked at me across a dying campfire like he wanted to, and that look burned worse than either of the first two. I was 18 years old, and I owed a stranger everything I had left in the world. My father died on a Tuesday in March, face down in a field he didn't own anymore, his heart giving out before the bank finished taking the rest of him. I found out he'd borrowed money, real money, more than our little house was worth, from a rancher 3 counties over named Weston Calloway. A man I had never met. A man whose name my father had never once said out loud at our supper table. I buried my father with money I didn't have, using a shovel that wasn't mine, on land that would belong to someone else by the end of the month. And 3 days after the funeral, a letter arrived. No condolences. No softness. Just an address, a date, and a single line in careful handwriting. Your father's debt is now yours. Come work it off, or I'll come collect it another way. I told myself I'd hate him before I ever saw his face. The Calloway Ranch sat at the base of a mountain range that turned gold at sunset, the kind of gold that makes you forget, for one dangerous second, that you're standing on land that isn't yours and never will be. I arrived on foot, dust in my boots and grief still fresh enough to taste, and the first thing I saw was a man standing in the corral with his back to me, gentling a horse that didn't want to be gentled. He didn't turn around right away. He let the horse decide to trust him first. When he finally did turn, I understood immediately why my father had never mentioned his name at supper, because no father wants to admit he owes his life to a man built like a closed door and a held breath. Weston Calloway was maybe 24. Broad-shouldered, sun-browned, quiet in a way that made you want to fill the silence just to see what he'd do with it. His eyes were a pale, startling gray, like weather about to change. He looked at me the way he'd looked at the horse, like he already knew I'd fight him before I settled. "You're late," he said. "You're rude," I said back, before I could stop myself. Something almost like amusement crossed his face and vanished just as fast. "Name?" "Eli." "Eli Whitfield." "Well, Eli Whitfield." He turned back to the horse. "Get the fence post out of your spine and grab a shovel. Debt doesn't work itself off." That was the whole conversation. That was how it started, with a dead father, a debt I hadn't chosen, and a man who wouldn't so much as ask if I'd eaten that day. I hated him instantly. I hated him for 3 more days, actually, right up until the moment I watched him carry a half-frozen lamb inside his coat in the middle of the night, whispering to it like it could understand him, and I realized the man who'd sent me that cold, careless letter wasn't cold at all. He was just careful. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to learn it, and even longer to admit that the learning had changed something in me. The work was brutal in a way I hadn't expected. Fences that stretched for miles. Cattle that didn't care about my grief. Mornings that started before the sun and nights that ended long after it set. My hands split open in the first week and healed calloused by the second. I ate at his table because he never once suggested I eat anywhere else, and I slept in the bunkhouse loft because it was the only bed offered, and somewhere in the blur of exhaustion and dust and the particular ache of missing a father who'd left me a debt instead of a goodbye, I started watching Weston Calloway the way you watch Weather You Can't Outrun. He didn't talk much. When he did, it mattered. He'd tell me which way a storm was coming from just by the smell of the wind. He'd tell me a horse's whole history by the way it flinched at a raised hand. He never told me anything about himself, not directly, but I learned him anyway, the way he hummed low and tuneless when he thought no one could hear, the way his jaw ticked when he was angry and trying not to show it, the way he always put his own coat over the fence post at night in case I got cold before I got proud enough to ask for one. "You don't have to do that," I told him one night, nodding at the coat. "I know," he said. "Then why do you?" He looked at me for a long moment, gray eyes steady in the dark. "Because I want to." I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was cold. Because I wasn't, and I couldn't stop thinking about why. 3 weeks in, I asked him the question I'd been chewing on since the second night, when I'd overheard 2 ranch hands muttering something ugly and low that they hadn't meant for me to hear. They said you don't take a wife because you don't want one, I said, not looking at him, focusing very hard on the fence post I was hammering. Said it like it was something wrong with you. Weston didn't stop working. And what do you think? I think, I said carefully, that a man's business is his business. He was quiet long enough that I thought I'd made a mistake asking at all. Then, it's true. I don't want a wife. A pause. The hammer in his hand went still. Never have. I finally looked at him. He wasn't looking away from me, and he wasn't looking ashamed, either. He was looking at me like he'd just handed me something breakable and was waiting to see if I'd drop it. I didn't drop it. Okay, I said. Just that. Okay. Something in his shoulders came down, like he'd been braced for a blow that never landed. He went back to the fence post. But that night at supper, he passed me the last piece of cornbread without being asked, and our fingers brushed for half a second longer than they needed to, and neither of us said a word about it, and both of us noticed. That was the beginning of the part of the story I still don't have all the words for, the slow, dangerous, beautiful unraveling of 2 men who weren't supposed to want each other and wanted each other anyway. It crept in through small things. The way I started listening for his boots on the porch before I let myself relax into sleep. The way he started teaching me things he didn't have to teach a dead hand, how to read a sky before a storm, how to gentle a spooked horse with nothing but your voice, how to sit still enough that a wild thing might choose to come closer on its own. I understood, eventually, that he was teaching me the same lesson twice. Once for the horses. Once for himself. There was a day in early summer when a storm caught us both out on the far ridge, lightning cracking too close, rain coming down in sheets that stung like gravel. We took shelter in an old line shack, soaked through, shivering, and Weston built a fire with hands that were remarkably steady for a man whose eyes kept finding mine and then, deliberately, looking away. You're staring, I said, teeth chattering, half a laugh in it. I'm not, he said, staring. West. It was the first time I'd used the shortened version of his name. It came out of me soft, almost involuntary, and I watched it land on him like a physical thing. His jaw ticked. His gray eyes went darker, the way the sky does right before it opens up completely. Say that again, he said, low. West, I said again, closer this time, close enough to feel the heat coming off him, close enough that the rain hammering the roof sounded very far away. Neither of us moved for a long moment. His eyes dropped to my mouth and came back up, like he was asking permission he was too proud to ask out loud. My heart was doing something violent and unfamiliar in my chest. I could feel his breath, could see the exact moment he decided to close the distance. And then a horse screamed outside, spooked by the thunder, and the moment broke like glass. We were up and moving before either of us could say anything about what had almost happened. But that night, lying in the loft, I pressed my fingers to my own mouth and thought about a kiss that never landed, and I understood, with a kind of terror I hadn't expected, that I wanted it to land. Badly. Completely. In a way that had nothing to do with debt and everything to do with a man who'd covered me with his coat before I'd ever asked to be warm. Summer deepened, and so did we, carefully, quietly, like 2 people learning a language neither of us had been taught to speak. There were long evenings on the porch where our shoulders would end up pressed together and neither of us moved away. There were mornings when he'd hand me coffee before I'd even asked for it, his fingers lingering half a second too long against mine. There was a night we sat under more stars than I'd ever seen in my life, and he told me, quiet and unguarded, about a boy he'd loved once when he was younger than me, and how that boy had married a woman 2 counties over out of fear, and how Weston had spent years afterward convincing himself he didn't need what he couldn't safely have. And now? I asked. He looked at me like the question had cost him something to hear. Now I'm not so sure I believe that anymore. I wanted, more than I had ever wanted anything, to close the distance between us that night. I didn't. Not because I didn't want him, I wanted him so much it frightened me, but because some old, careful part of me was still grieving my father, still tangled up in guilt about wanting anything good in the middle of so much loss. I told myself there would be time. I told myself the moment would come again. I didn't know yet how close I was to losing it entirely. His name was Callum Reyes, and he showed up at the ranch on a Thursday with a smile made for charming strangers and a way of standing too close to Weston that made something ugly and unfamiliar twist in my chest. He was an old friend, Weston explained, a cattle buyer from 2 states over, in the area for business, staying a week. He was handsome in an easy, practiced way, the kind of handsome that knows exactly what it's doing. And from the first evening, it was clear he and Weston had history. The kind of history made of shared laughter and old nicknames and a familiarity I hadn't earned yet and wasn't sure I ever would. I watched them across the supper table, watched the way Callum's hand found Weston's forearm to punctuate a joke, watched the way Weston, my careful, guarded Weston, who barely let anyone close enough to touch him, let it stay there. And something in me went cold and small and furious, and I hated myself for how much it hurt. "You're quiet tonight," Weston said to me later, once Callum had gone to the guest room. "I'm tired," I lied. He studied me for a long moment, gray eyes narrowing slightly, like he could see straight through the lie and was choosing, for now, not to call it out. "All right," he said. But he didn't sound like he believed me, and I didn't sound like I believed myself. The week that followed was the longest of my life. I threw myself into the work, taking on more than I needed to, coming in late and leaving early, anything to avoid the sight of Callum's easy hands finding their way onto Weston's shoulders, his arms, the small of his back. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I had no claim on a man I'd never even kissed. I told myself 100 reasonable things, and none of them stopped the jealousy from curdling into something that felt dangerously close to grief. It came to a head on the 5th night, when I walked past the barn and heard them laughing together in the dark, low, easy, familiar laughter, and something in me simply broke. I didn't go in. I turned around and walked to the far pasture instead, sat down in the dirt under a sky gone indigo with dusk, and let myself feel, for the first time since my father died, entirely and completely alone. Weston found me an hour later. I heard his boots before I saw him, and I didn't turn around, and he sat down beside me without asking permission, close enough that our shoulders touched. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been busy." Eli. Just my name. But the way he said it cracked something open in me anyway. "He touches you like he's allowed to," I said, before I could stop myself, staring hard at the darkening horizon. "Like it's easy. Like it doesn't cost him anything." Silence, for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Callum and I were something, once. A long time ago. It ended because I wanted more than he was willing to risk, and he wanted safe more than he wanted me." A pause. "It's not what you think it is." "It's not my business either way," I said, even though my voice betrayed exactly how much it was. Weston turned to look at me fully then, and in the dying light his gray eyes had gone soft in a way I'd never seen. "Eli. Look at me." I did. I couldn't have refused him if I'd tried. "I have spent every night for 2 months making sure you had a coat over that fence post," he said, low and steady, each word deliberate, like he'd been holding them back for a long time and had finally run out of room to hold them. "I have watched you become the best part of my day, every single day, without meaning to let that happen. Callum is an old ghost. You are not a ghost to me. You are the first thing that's felt real in years." My heart was slamming so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. "Then why didn't you say something?" I whispered. "Because you buried your father 2 months ago," he said. "Because you came here owing me a debt, and the last thing I ever wanted was for you to feel like wanting me was part of the payment. I needed you to choose it. Freely. With nothing owed. I understood, in that moment, every careful distance he'd kept, every unspoken thing he'd swallowed rather than risk. I understood that the coldest letter I'd ever received had been written by the gentlest man I'd ever met, and that gentleness had cost him more than cruelty ever would have. "I'm choosing it," I said. "I've been choosing it for weeks. I just didn't know I was allowed to." The space between us had never felt smaller, or more terrifying, or more inevitable. "Eli," he said again, softer this time, like my name was something he wanted to be careful with. "West." He reached up, slow, giving me every chance to pull away, and cupped my jaw in a hand rough with years of work and impossibly gentle anyway. I didn't pull away. I leaned in instead, and when our mouths finally met, it wasn't hesitant at all, it was 2 months of almosts finally allowed to become something whole. It was quiet and warm and utterly unhurried, his other hand coming up to rest against my chest like he wanted to feel my heart racing, like he needed proof this was real. When we finally broke apart, foreheads still touching, both of us breathing like we'd run a mile, he laughed, a low, disbelieving sound I'd never heard from him before. "I have wanted to do that since the storm," he admitted. "I know," I said. "I've wanted you to do it since before I knew what wanting meant." Callum left 3 days later, and before he did, he found me alone by the corral and studied me with a knowing, unbothered kind of amusement. "He's different with you," Callum said. "I've known him 8 years. I've never seen him like this." "Like what?" "Unafraid," he said simply, and walked away before I could ask him to explain further. The weeks that followed were the happiest of my life, and I say that knowing exactly how much grief I was still carrying, knowing exactly how strange it is to hold sorrow and joy in the same 2 open hands. Weston and I were careful in front of the other hands. This was still a world with sharp edges, and neither of us was naive about that, but in private, in the quiet hours before dawn and the long gold hours after supper, we were unguarded in a way I hadn't known I was capable of being with another person. He told me, one night, that he was tearing up the debt. That he'd been planning to for weeks, actually, ever since the storm, ever since he'd realized he didn't want to be the man who kept me here out of obligation, he wanted to be the reason I chose to stay. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You never really did. The debt was your father's, and grief made me cruel enough to hand it to his son instead of burying it with him where it belonged. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that." "West," I said, throat tight, "I'm not staying because of debt. I haven't been for a long time." "Then why are you staying?" I took his rough, careful hand in mine, right there in the gold evening light, in front of God and the mountains and anyone who cared to look. "Because you're the first home I've had since I buried my father," I said. "And I'm not in any hurry to leave it." He kissed me again, slow and certain, and somewhere behind us a horse nickered softly, and the whole ranch seemed to hold its breath around us the way it does right before something good and lasting finally settles into place. I came to that ranch a grieving boy with a debt he didn't choose and a name he'd never heard at his own father's table. I found, instead, a man who covered me with his coat before I ever asked to be warm, a man who taught me that gentleness and strength aren't opposites, that love doesn't announce itself with fireworks but with quiet, consistent choosing, night after night, coat after coat, storm after storm. The debt was paid a long time before either of us admitted it. What we built after, that was never owed to anyone. That was simply ours. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment below. It means more than you know. And if you want to know what happened the following winter, when an old enemy of Weston's threatened everything they'd built together. The gun was pressed against Weston's chest before I even understood what I was looking at. I remember the cold hitting me first, the kind of cold that comes right before a hard freeze, the kind that makes the air taste like metal. And then I remember the man standing in our doorway, snow melting off his shoulders, a revolver held steady in a hand that didn't shake at all. "Evening, Calloway," the stranger said. "Bet you thought I was dead." Weston went very still beside me. Stiller than I'd ever seen him, stiller than the night of the storm, stiller than the night he'd told me he loved me for the first time under a sky full of more stars than I could count. "Marsh," Weston said, low. "You should have stayed dead." That was the moment I understood that the man I loved had a past he'd never once let me see the edges of, and that whatever it was, it had just walked through our door carrying a gun. Winter had come early that year, settling over the ranch in a hush of white that made everything look softer than it was. Weston and I had spent 3 seasons building something neither of us had dared name out loud in front of the other hands, but everyone knew anyway, the way he passed me coffee before I asked, the way I'd taken to sleeping in the main house instead of the loft, the way our hands found each other in the dark without either of us reaching first. It had been, without exaggeration, the best season of my life. I should have known peace like that doesn't come free. 3 days before the man with the gun arrived, Weston had been quieter than usual. I'd noticed it, the way his eyes lingered too long on the tree line at dusk, the way he'd started keeping his rifle closer to the door than he used to. "You've been somewhere else all week," I told him one night, pulling his attention back from wherever it kept drifting. He was quiet for a long moment, jaw working the way it did when he was deciding how much truth to hand me. "Before I bought this land," he said finally, "I ran with men I'm not proud of. Cattle that wasn't ours to sell. Money that wasn't ours to take." His gray eyes found mine, heavy with something I hadn't seen in him before, shame. "There was a man named Everett Marsh. We were partners, once. Close, the way you get close to someone when you're both young and reckless and think you're invincible." A pause. "He got greedy. I got out. It didn't end friendly." "How unfriendly?" "He went to prison for 6 years because I testified against him," Weston said quietly. "He swore, the day they took him out of that courtroom, that he'd come back and take everything I ever built. I told myself he was just talking." His hand found mine, gripped it tight. "I heard 3 weeks ago that he was released early. I didn't want to scare you before I had to." I understood, in that moment, that the gentlest man I knew had spent years being braced for a storm he never talked about, the same way he'd once been braced for love he never let himself ask for. "You should have told me," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you now." 2 nights later, Everett Marsh walked through our door with a gun and a grudge 6 years in the making. "You've got something of mine," Marsh said, that revolver never wavering from Weston's chest. His eyes flicked to me, sharp and assessing, and something ugly curled at the corner of his mouth. "And I see you've got yourself a pretty new arrangement since I've been away." "Leave him out of this," Weston said, voice low and dangerous in a way I'd never heard from him. "This is between you and me. Everything that's yours is between you and me, Calloway. That's how it works when a man rats out his own partner." Marsh took a step closer. "You took my freedom. I figure it's only fair I take something of yours." My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I thought about the debt that had brought me here, a debt of money, a debt I'd resented before I understood it was really an invitation into the life of a man who would come to mean more to me than anything I'd ever owned. I thought about how strange it was that the second debt in this house, the one Marsh believed Weston owed him, was about to be collected in blood if I didn't do something. "He's not the one who put you in prison," I said, stepping forward despite the way Weston's hand shot out to try to stop me. "You did that yourself, the day you decided greed mattered more than the man standing next to you." Marsh's eyes cut to me, cold and furious. "Careful, boy. I'm not scared of you," I said, and to my own surprise, it was mostly true. "You didn't come here to kill him. If you wanted him dead, you'd have done it the second the door opened instead of talking. You came here because some part of you still wants him to see you as something other than a man who threw away everything good he had." Something flickered across Marsh's face, a crack, hairline thin, in 6 years of hardened resolve. "You don't know anything about me," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "I know a man who wanted to be scary would have already pulled that trigger," I said, quieter now. "I know a man who's still talking wants something more than blood. Maybe he wants to be heard. Maybe he wants someone to admit he mattered before everything went wrong. Weston, beside me, had gone very still, watching Marsh with an expression I couldn't quite read, old grief, maybe, tangled up with old fear. "Everett," Weston said, and his voice had changed, softened into something that sounded almost like the boy he must have been before any of this. "I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted out of a life that was going to get us both killed or caged, and I was right, because it got you caged anyway. I'm sorry it cost you what it cost you. I am. But I'm not sorry I chose different." The revolver in Marsh's hand dropped, slowly, to his side. 6 years, Marsh said, and his voice cracked on it, I told myself I hated you enough to do this. I don't know if I do anymore. Then don't, Weston said. Put it down. Walk away clean. That's all I ever wanted from you, even back then. Marsh left that night the way he'd come, into the snow, into the dark, but without the gun raised, without the fury that had walked in the door. Whether he'd truly let it go, none of us could say for certain. But he never came back, not that winter, not the next, and slowly the tension that had lived in Weston's shoulders for weeks began, finally, to ease. That night, once the house was locked and quiet and the fire had burned low, Weston pulled me into his arms in a way that felt different from every embrace before it, like relief given a physical shape, like a man reminding himself that the thing he loved was still standing in front of him, warm and whole and choosing to stay. You could have gotten yourself killed, he said into my hair, voice rough. So could you, I said. I wasn't going to just stand there. I know. His arms tightened around me. That terrifies me more than Marsh ever could. The thought of losing you. I pulled back enough to look at him, at the gray eyes that had gone soft and unguarded, at the face I'd come to know better than my own. You're not losing me, West. Not to Marsh, not to anybody. I buried one home already. I'm not in any hurry to bury another. He kissed me then, slow and grateful and certain, the kind of kiss that carries a whole winter's worth of fear finally allowed to unclench. Spring came late that year, but it came. The snow melted off the mountains in long silver ribbons, and the ranch woke up green and loud with new calves and longer days, and Weston and I stood on the porch one evening watching the sun go down gold over land that had once felt like a dead and now, simply, felt like home. I used to think love was a thing you had to earn, Weston said quietly, his hand finding mine the way it always did now, without either of us reaching first. 6 years of running from men like Marsh taught me that. Taught me to keep everyone at arm's length, in case they turned out to want something from me I couldn't afford to give. And now? He turned to look at me, and there wasn't a trace of that old caution left in his face. Now I think the only debt worth paying is the one you pay because you want to. Every single day. For as long as they'll let you. Good, I said, leaning into him. Because I'm not sending you a bill. He laughed, that low, disbelieving laugh I'd come to love more than almost any other sound in the world, and pulled me closer, and we stood together on that porch until the gold went out of the sky and the stars came up to take its place, two men who had both been taught, in different ways, that love was dangerous, and who had chosen it anyway. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment. I read every single one. There's still one story left untold, the night Eli finally met the family Weston never talks about, and the truth about why he left them behind. Don't go in there, Weston said, gripping my arm hard enough to bruise, his voice cracking in a way I had never once heard from him. Please. Not yet. I had never seen him beg for anything. Not during the storm, not the night Marsh walked through our door with a gun. But standing on the porch of a house he hadn't set foot in for 8 years, watching his hands shake for the first time since I'd known him, I understood that some debts aren't made of money at all, some are made of silence, and they're the hardest ones of all to finally pay. It started with a letter, the way most turning points in our life together seemed to. Weston had gone quiet reading it at the kitchen table, his jaw tight, his gray eyes fixed on something far past the page in his hands. My mother's dying, he said finally, setting it down like it weighed more than paper should. Cancer. My sister wrote to tell me, in case I wanted to say goodbye. Do you? I asked carefully. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I reached across the table and took his hand, the way he'd taken mine so many times over the past year, steady, unhurried, simply there. I haven't spoken to my family in 8 years, he said finally. Not since the night my father found out what I was and told me I wasn't his son anymore. I left with nothing but a horse and enough anger to build a whole life out of spite. His thumb moved absently over my knuckles. I told myself I didn't need them. I built this ranch to prove I didn't. And now? Now my mother is dying, and some part of me still wants her to know I turned out all right, he admitted, voice rough. Even though the last thing she ever said to me was that she hoped I'd change before it was too late. I squeezed his hand. Then let's go say goodbye. Together, if you'll let me. He looked at me like I'd offered him something he hadn't let himself hope for. You'd do that? Walk into that house, knowing what they might say to you? To us? West, I said gently, I buried my father owing a debt I never chose. You're about to lose your mother carrying a silence you didn't choose either. I'm not going to let you do that alone. The Calloway family home sat 2 counties over, a tidy white farmhouse that looked, from the outside, like nothing bad had ever happened inside it. Weston's hands hadn't stopped trembling since we'd tied up the horses. His sister, Marguerite, met us at the door, a tall, sharp-eyed woman with Weston's same steady gray gaze, though hers had softened with years he hadn't been there to see. She looked at her brother for a long moment, taking in 8 years of change all at once, and then, without a word, she pulled him into a fierce, unguarded hug. You came, she said into his shoulder, voice thick. You wrote, he said back, just as thick. She pulled back and looked at me next, taking in the way Weston's hand had found mine without either of us thinking about it, the way we stood close enough that our shoulders touched. You must be Eli, she said. West mentioned you. Once. In a letter he never sent, that I found anyway, snooping through his old desk before he left. A small, wry smile. He described you as complicated. I can see now that meant important. I felt Weston go rigid beside me, half embarrassed, half terrified of what I might say. I just smiled. I'd say that's fair. His mother was smaller than I imagined, thin and pale against white sheets, but her eyes, the same startling gray as her son's, were sharp and clear when Weston finally stepped into the room. Weston, she said, voice fragile but steady. I wondered if you'd come. I almost didn't, he admitted, standing frozen in the doorway. I wasn't sure I'd be welcome. You're my son, she said simply. You were always welcome. I was just too proud and too frightened to say so before now. Her eyes moved past him to me, standing quiet at his shoulder. Is this the young man Marguerite mentioned? This is Eli, Weston said, and I heard, for the first time, none of the old caution in his voice when he said my name in front of his family. Just plain, unguarded fact. He's who I love. The room went very still. I felt my own heart pounding, bracing for the same cruelty that had sent him running 8 years ago. His mother studied me for a long, searching moment. Then, quietly, you look at my son the way his father used to look at me, before life made him hard and afraid. Her thin hand reached for Weston's. I was wrong, all those years ago. I let fear speak louder than love, and it cost me 8 years with my own son I'll never get back. I won't make that mistake again in whatever time I have left. Weston's composure finally broke. He sank into the chair beside her bed, gripping her hand like a boy half his age, and wept, not from grief alone, but from the particular, overwhelming relief of a door he'd thought was closed forever swinging quietly open instead. I stood back and let them have that moment, my own eyes stinging, understanding that I was witnessing the final piece of a debt none of us had ever spoken of out loud, the debt of silence, finally, mercifully paid. She passed 3 weeks later, peacefully, with her son at her side and her daughter holding her other hand, and me standing quietly in the doorway where Weston had once stood too afraid to enter. It was a grief different from the one I'd carried for my own father, softer somehow, wrapped in the knowledge that nothing had been left unsaid. "Thank you," Weston told me that night, sitting on the porch of his childhood home under a sky just as full of stars as the one back at the ranch. "For making me walk through that door. I don't know if I'd have found the courage on my own." "You'd have found it," I said. "Eventually. I just didn't want you carrying it alone until you did." He turned to look at me then, gray eyes soft in the dark, and something in his expression made my breath catch the way it had that very first night by the corral, when I hadn't yet known that the cold letter I'd received would lead me to the warmest home I'd ever have. "I have something to ask you," he said, and his voice had gone unsteady in a way I'd never heard, not even the night Marsh had a gun to his chest. He reached into his coat pocket, and my heart stopped entirely when I saw what was in his hand, a simple band of plain gold, worn smooth like it had been carried close to his chest for longer than I realized. "It's not legal, not everywhere, not yet," he said quietly. "I know that. But I don't need a courthouse to tell me what I already know standing right here. I've spent my whole life keeping people at arm's length so they couldn't leave a mark on me the way my family did. And then you showed up, grieving and furious and stubborn as hell, and you marked me anyway. Every single day since." "West," my voice broke on his name. "I'm not asking because of debt," he said. "There was never a debt worth this. I'm asking because I want to spend every ordinary evening for the rest of my life passing you the last piece of cornbread and covering you with my coat before you're cold enough to ask for it. I'm asking because you are, without question, the truest home I have ever had." His hand, finally steady, held the ring out between us. "Eli Whitfield. Will you stay? Not because you owe me anything, because you choose to. Every day, for as long as you'll have me." I didn't need a single second to answer. I closed the distance between us the way I had that first night by the corral fence, and kissed him slow and sure under a sky full of every star we'd ever counted together. "Yes," I said against his mouth, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, West. Every day." We buried the last of the silence that had haunted this family right alongside his mother, and we built something new on top of it, a ranch full of noise and warmth and 2 names finally spoken freely at the same supper table. Marguerite visited every spring after that, bringing nephews and nieces who called Weston Uncle West without a trace of the shame that had once driven him away, and who looked at me like family, because that's exactly what I'd become. I came to that ranch 18 years old, grieving, furious, and certain that love was a debt I could never afford. I found, instead, a man patient enough to wait for me to choose him freely, and in the choosing, I found the only home that ever truly felt paid in full. This has been the final chapter of our story. Thank you for staying with Eli and Weston from that very first cold letter all the way to this porch under the stars. If their story moved you even half as much as it moved me to tell it, please subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment below. It truly means the world and helps more stories like this one find their way to you. Until the next story, take care of yourselves, and of each other.